All right, well, good evening, everyone. Everyone on Zoom, all 25 of you, and about the same in the room here at the Nature Center. Yeah, so good to see everyone after the Snow Goose Festival. Not quite as big of a program tonight, but a really exciting one. Nonetheless, we'll have Michelle Graydon with us. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask about sightings. Anybody have any exciting sightings recently? Enter.
Ferruginous hawks out on Meridian Road.
Ferruginous hawks on Meridian Road. Nice.
They finally made it. We've been waiting for them all winter. They have, and then just the other day, Sunday, we were going through there, just a little ride. There they were.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's great. Any other sightings? I found a golden eagle out by the Sacramento River last week. I was out with Grant Heath, and we were talking about how a lot of new birders might see a juvenile bald eagle and confuse it with a golden eagle. And we were laughing because, oh, there's way more bald eagles than golden eagles. But then sure enough, we see a bird that we thought was a turkey vulture, investigate further, had a gold head, gold nape. It had a somewhat muted two-tone underside of the wings and then had a white patch on the tail. So we knew it was a golden eagle. All right. So tonight we have Michelle Graydon joining us. Michelle has a BS in biological sciences from CSU Chico and is a Xerces Society Ambassador, as well as a Bumblebee Watch citizen scientist and a Butte County Master Gardener, as well as a macro photography enthusiast. Um, Michelle will share the work of the Xerces Society and have some information for how you can make a difference in your home and in your local environment. And so, yeah, the Xerces Society is a research-based international organization established in 1972, dedicated to the conservation of insects and other invertebrates because pollinating species are considered keystone indicators on environmental health. All right. So Michelle, she recently returned from a macro and nature photography workshop in Brazil, photographing, among other wonders, bioluminescent termite mounds. Wow. Lots of cool. Well, without further ado, Michelle Graydon.
Okay, good evening. I'm very honored to be here. And I want to start off by just saying that that was a very nice introduction. I don't really need to add anything. I've been a Chico resident for a long time, and it's nice to see some familiar faces. So my goal tonight is to introduce you to the Xerces Society, if you're not familiar with us, and it's an international nonprofit. We are dedicated to, we're dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates. And I will go into that in a little bit, what they are, what it is we're concerned about. Our priorities include habitat for one thing, reducing pesticide use worldwide, protection of endangered at-risk species, and education and research. It was named for a butterfly, the Xerces blue, which went extinct in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 40s. And a group of scientists got together and concerned about the lack of interest and lack of research in invertebrates. And they are, after all, the little things that run the world. And so they started the Xerces Society. So what is an invertebrate? Well, they are animals without backbones, and they include insects. They include crustaceans, arachnids, which are spiders, scorpions, and so on. And the insects are the largest group. They contain over 1 million described species. That's not all the species out there. And they include important pollinators. So why are we worried about protecting them? Well, they're the foundation of complex food chains, key to biodiversity. And our data indicates, and data all over the world, that they are declining. They make up the invertebrate pollinators, enable the fruits and seeds, making up a major part of the diet of many things. They are food themselves. They're essential, as you can see, to ecosystems throughout the world. And I like Aldo Leopold's comment, the last word in ignorance is the man who says of any animal or plant, what good is it? So what is pollination? It is the transfer of pollen from the male anther to a female part of the flower, the stigma, leads to seed and fruit formation. And so, fruit and seed. Plants can't do that. They can't walk around and introduce each other. They need a vector. They need some way to get that pollen transferred. And this is where pollinators come in. But what is a pollinator? And there's a little confusion. You hear a lot about, say, the pollinators are in trouble, but actually it's the transferring of this viable pollen between flowers of the same species that leads to fruit and seed formation. The reproduction of a plant is what we need, and that's what is the keystone here for these ecosystems. So an animal is a pollinator if it does that. Otherwise, they are just basically flower visitors, and we have a lot of those. You'll see a lot of animals on flowers, but they're not necessarily pollinating. Vertebrates and invertebrates can be pollinators. The bat is a good example. They are mostly in other parts of the world. South America, for example, we have insectivorous bats up here. You all know hummingbirds are good pollinators, and the rest are invertebrate pollinators. And they are the most important. They are the main vectors of pollen transfer for all wild and cultivated plants. Wind and water are also good pollinators. The invertebrate pollinators have a very important role in the ecosystem. Like I said, they lead to the reproduction of plants. That leads to a healthy ecosystem. We provide, and healthy ecosystems, what do we care? Well, living things get services from ecosystems. We get carbon sequestration, we get water purification, we get healthy soils, and we also get food, resources, and nesting sites for other animals. So butterflies, moths, beetles, and flies, excuse me, beetles, wasps, and bees are the main invertebrate pollinators. And food production, of course, everyone knows, a lot of you have seen the 1 in 3 bites of your food and that sort of thing. And it's kind of true. I like this poster over here because all of these foods that we're missing on the top plate but are showing up on the bottom are from native bees, pollination from native bees, bumblebees, squash bees, mason bees, for example. We have quite an industry. I will back up and say that about 3/4 of all our crops require some form of pollinator, but only about 1/3 of crop production does. It's a big business, 15 to 20 billion in the US and 4 billion for native bees. And just as an example, worldwide, the market value from chocolate, which is from a cacao plant, which is midge pollinated, that's a fly. So they're pretty critical. And bees are the most important pollinators. They have 3 distinct behaviors. They are highly efficient at collecting and transporting pollen. They can forage from plant to plant right around their nests, and they exhibit what's called floral constancy or faithfulness. They'll go back to the same plant. And because you need the pollen from one plant species to go to the same plant species, this is why they're very important. And then flies. These are all examples of flies. Most of these photos are mine, and I took a lot of these locally. So you can see a lot of this in your own backyard. The 3 flies up here on the whiter flowers I took at high elevation. Those were taken over 9,000 feet this summer, but they're very good at pollinating at higher elevations and altitudes because bees drop out and the flies don't. They can survive, so they're quite important up high and at higher altitudes. I mean, latitudes, excuse me. What also makes them so good at pollinating are their branched hairs. And this is a unique feature of bees. They can pick pollen up quite easily with these branched hairs. The pollen sticks to them. They also produce an electrostatic charge. The plant is grounded, it doesn't move. The bee flies through the air, picks up some electrostatic charge and allows it to hold pollen. And pollen's characteristic. Each plant species has its own particular pollen, and it contains protein, lipids, and carbohydrates, which are all essential for larval development. And that's what we're talking about, basically, when we talk about these kinds of things that are coming up. It's about the development of the larva for the resources from the plant. And how do they transport it? They can do it in a couple of ways. A few species of bees, honeybees, bumblebees, stingless bees in South America and Asia, they mix it with nectar and they carry it kind of like Play-Doh on their back legs. And then on dry hairs, for the most part, on a structure called a scopa or a pollen brush. And these are found on their legs, often underside of the abdomen. They could be on the back or thorax. And they can also carry it internally, like a bird would in their crop and then regurgitate that to their larvae. And this is all an example of dry pollen carrying. These were taken right in my backyard. That's a leafcutter bee, and you can see the pollen on her abdomen quite nicely in that cercium. And then a valley carpenter bee, and the insert shows her, I got her going into the flower, and then as she came out, you can see the pollen all over the top of her head. She's not yellow, that's her pollen. And then she'll groom that off and take that back to her nest. And the little tiny bee on the end is called a mass bee or Hylaeus, and they carry pollen internally in their crops. And then this is the moist carrying. That's a bumblebee on the end. They're very, in addition to honeybees, very efficient at this. And this structure has a name, it's called a corbicula. And you can also see the long hairs, which help them to hold this pollen basket. And what about male bees? They're kind of fascinating. They have one job in life. They mate, they're gone. They don't do anything else. They don't help around the house. They don't help with the young. They literally are solely responsible for mating. They don't have pollen collecting apparatus. They usually appear a bit differently. They usually have pretty big eyes so they can see the females better. They come out of the nest first and then they don't return for the most part. They aren't allowed back in. You can sometimes find them sleeping together on flowers at night. It's kind of sad and cute at the same time. But they're also unable to sting because the stinger has evolved from an ovipositor, which is what is the egg-laying apparatus. So you could pick a male bee up without any fear at all. Wasps as well. And then we have a large number of bees worldwide. These are the number of species so far identified. And this is the chart that shows you the families. There are 7. We have 6 of those families and 4,000 species in North America. And in California, we have 1,500 plus of those. We have a lot of bees here. And most of that diversity is in the Southwest ecosystems. And there's some interesting reasons for that. But it's not in the wetter, more temperate places. It's in the Southwest. And then in California urban gardens, including up here, just about any urban garden, you can find quite a few species. I've probably counted 50. I think my friend Rob has counted over 70 or 80. And the Berkeley Bee Lab in Berkeley, the urban bee lab, as they call themselves, have studied this. And they said at least 90 to 100 bees, native bees, use urban gardens. So this is one reason why to consider pollinating plants as well, pollinator-friendly plants. And then I do want to talk about the honeybee to clear up any misconceptions. I'm not a honeybee expert. They're very important for crop pollination. They were introduced to North America. The industry is really afflicted by disease, by pests, especially varroa mites, by toxicity from insecticides, from nutritional stress, and even low honey prices from competition. But they're not endangered, and we don't need to save the honeybee. And I think that started at about 2007 when colony collapse disorder was first identified, and there was a lot of alarm. And they've learned a lot since then. And one thing we do know is that they are not endangered. However, this slide shows you, these are from the same year, 2 different articles, 2 different newspapers. They're saying 2 different things. They've suffered their deadliest season on record, and they have a record number of bees. We have a record number of bees. So what's going on? Well, we do have about 3.8 million colonies in the US, but the losses are high, and they were very high in 22, 23, and reportedly are going to be high again. Honeybee keepers anticipate about a 21% loss every winter, and they call it winter loss. Colony collapse disorder is still around, but it's around 100,000 colonies that I read my last statistic on that. But we're adding them. They split them. They produce different colonies from colonies that have been started. They take queens and build colonies. And so we've added about 1 million colonies in the last 5 years. And most of those are small producers out of Texas. And there's a reason for that. But their numbers worldwide have actually grown. So one thing a lot of people want to know is, should I keep a backyard beehive? Will I help this pollinator problem? Well, Xerces says no. They're an exotic species. They can cause negative ecological disturbances. They, especially in large numbers, and some of their hives can get up to over 60,000 individuals strong. They have been shown to reduce the abundance of native bee species. They compete. There's disease transmission. There's a number of problems. So we don't encourage it. However, because it's not pollinator conservation, but if you want to do something, create pollinator habitat, that benefits honeybees and it benefits native bees, both. And the diversity is huge. If you look around the world at these 20,000 bees worldwide, the one on the left is the backyard bee sample from North America. I took the one in the middle in Brazil. Those are stingless bees. They're pretty interesting. They do produce honey. And then the end poster are worldwide bees. You can see the diversity of colors, sizes, shapes. They're pretty fascinating. And then sizes locally. This is the world's largest bee in the upper left. That's the megachile. And it is megachile Pluto, Wallace's bee, staring down the world's smallest bee, which is Perdita minima. The Valley Carpenter queen or Valley Carpenter female here is our largest bee, and she just has pollen on her back, so that's not her color. Sometimes bumblebee queens can get as large, maybe a little larger, but generally these are considered our largest bee. And then that very tiny bee up in the right on the milkweed is a carpenter bee as well. It's a Ceratina. And then the bottom bee is more typical of what you might see here in the summers. That's on a cosmos flower in my yard. It's called a summer longhorn bee, family genus Melissoides or family Melissoides. How do you tell the difference between a bee and a wasp? Well, bees have the branched hairs, and you generally see that when they're on the wing. They can carry pollen, and they're vegetarian. For the most part, there's a couple of rare exceptions. There are some carrying, eating bees, and by that I mean they take it back and feed it to their larvae. And then wasps, by contrast, have very few hairs, no pollen-carrying structures, and again, they're carnivorous, but there's one rare exception in one family where they are feeding pollen and nectar to their larvae. So bees, about 130 million years ago, evolved from wasps. So they are the vegetarian cousins, and there's a lot of theories on as to how this came about. It's pretty interesting, but they are closely related that way. And then what about a fly? How do you tell if it's a bee or a fly? A lot of flies are very, very good bee mimics. They get an advantage for doing that. Something thinks it's a bee, it's going to leave it alone. So bees tend to have longer antennae. They have eyes on the sides of their head for the most part, as you can see in this one. Branched hairs, pollen-carrying structure, and they have two pairs of wings. This is very distinctive between bees and flies. They hook together when they're flying. There's a structure called a hamuli that's like Velcro, kind of hooks the wings together, so you don't always notice that it's two wings on one side or two pair, but they do have that. And then the flies have the tiny antenna. That's one of the biggest giveaways. This is a bee. This is actually a robber fly, which loves to eat bees. And large eyes, you see those really, really large eyes, and they tend to meet in the middle. And they don't have the branched hairs, they don't carry pollen, and they have the one pair of wings. So there's some clues you can use to sort of help you tell them apart. And then I'll talk a little bit about native bee biology, which will lead us into what we can do in our own yards and homes. 90% of them are solitary. About 10% make social colonies, and the honeybees make the hives. Most of them are just on their own. They will build and provision a nest all by themselves, a single female. And they're not very likely to sting because they don't have a colony to protect. And then they also have, for the most part, 1-year life cycle. They have a variety of nesting strategies. We estimate about 70% will nest above ground. 70% will nest in the ground, and they lay their eggs in individual chambers that they've constructed, and 30% will nest above ground. And they have similar nesting cycles and that sort of thing, but in different places, and they're very particular about that. That bee in the upper right, I took in my yard. She was looking for a place to build her nest last spring, and that's a green sweat bee, Agapostemon. So you can look for those. You very likely will see them. And then there are the ground nesters. We'll go into those first. They like a variety of soil. They like slopes, some of them, sunny, open spaces. And the main thing to remember if you're thinking about habitat for native bees is they don't like heavily mulched areas. They won't nest in that. So they will avoid it. Their nest openings can look very, very different. I think they're really hard to find personally. You can often not even know you often don't know they're nesting there. But in some cases, they're more obvious, maybe like an ant nest opening. The one in the upper right there, these are called chimney bees. These build a nest that has a little chimney on the top opening. And they all have characteristic looking chambers underneath, as you can see there, with varying complexities. And I want to point out that a lot of people will call a yellow jacket wasp a ground bee, but it's not a bee at all. And it is a social wasp, and it does aggressively defend its nest, very aggressively sometimes, right? And then we have the tunnel nesters, or what we call the renters, because the majority will look for an already formed tunnel or cavity made usually by a beetle, a boring beetle in dead and dying wood or twigs, logs, and some of them in pithy dried stems. And I'll give you some examples of what pithy dried stem looks like. It means fairly soft, so they can excavate the center out a little better. And then man-made bee tubes. I have some examples of that, and we'll talk a little bit about bee houses, and if you're interested in that, how to go about it. In the right lower is a nest that was opened up, and those are all carpenter bee nests in there. And this is a leafcutter bee, and that little redbud sapling in my yard was really popular with the leafcutter bees last spring. And they cut the little holes out of the side of the leaf, roll them up, and carry them back, and then make their egg chambers with those. And the leaf family has a lot of different names. The bees do different things. There's a mason bee, a resin bee. Some of them use flower petals, mud, soil, and those kinds of things. So the name can often reflect what it is the bee is using to nest with. This will show you a bit about a typical bee's life cycle. And I think the important thing to note here is how little time these bees spend above ground. They're mostly underground or in a cavity. So the majority of their life is either being developed from the egg to the pupa, to the larva, pre-pupa, and then the adult bee. But they spend the last part of it overwintering. They can't come out and forage in the winter months, so they had to have a strategy to get through the winters, and this is it. And it's suspended animation, basically, called diapause. And then in the spring, when the conditions are right and they're triggered, they will come out and start foraging. And it's only a few months in some cases. In the case of osmia, they're constructing nests. It shows you up here from mid-March through maybe early April, May, and then they're done. And bumblebees, I'm going to talk just briefly. John Whittlesey gave you a fabulous talk in April on bumblebees. If you're interested, I highly recommend you go back and take a look at that. But they're the first to appear late winter, the last to stop foraging in the fall. They can carry twice as much pollen as other bees. John can correct me right on that, I hope. They start earlier in the day, that is known. They can handle the cooler temperatures, they work faster. And they do something called buzz pollinating. About 58% of bee species buzz pollinate, but honeybees can't. They can't do this. And that means that there are some flowers that have specialized anthers, and the pollen won't come out unless it's sonicated or buzzed. And then it comes out like a salt shaker. It's like you're shaking pollen out of it like a salt shaker. And so these bees, bumblebees, and the buzz pollinators are able to access that. This looks complicated, but I think it's interesting to point out because we're very concerned about bumblebees. We have 4 species in California that are on the endangered species list. We have around a quarter nationwide that are in trouble. So if you do see a nest or you're interested, it's good to know a little bit about their nesting behavior. In the early spring, a female, about right now, that's been mated, called queen, is now emerging from her underground hibernarium, and she's looking for a place to build a nest. And so number two, she finds a spot, maybe an old rodent burrow, which is what they really like, and goes in, starts her nest, starts foraging, provisioning. So she's acting like a solitary bee, essentially, in the beginning. And then her first eggs are laid, and she incubates those, just like a bird. She sits on them to warm them. She can vibrate her flight muscles to keep the eggs warm. And then those will hatch, and then she will move on. Those become her daughter workers, and they take over. They go out of the nest, they forage, they clean, and she just lays eggs. And so she continues to be the egg layer. They continue to take care of the nest. And then at some point, she's triggered to start laying male eggs. And she has a choice if she lays a male or a female egg. And so she'll decide, lay the male eggs, and then she will also lay eggs that are destined to become the next generation of queens. And they're called gynes until they're mated. And so these develop, and then eventually they leave the nest, the males and the gynes, and hopefully mate with females and males from other nests, so you get this diversity, and everybody else is gone. The cycle's over. They're gone that's it. So they're an annual colony. Honeybees, of course, are perennial. The queen stays, they go on through the winter. That's what their honey stores are all about, so they can get through the winter. So what is driving invertebrate declines, and what are the solutions? We see at Xerces three things that are contributing pretty heavily: climate change, pesticides, and habitat loss. I'm going to talk about them. Not necessarily are they important in that order, but I do just want to say about climate change that one of the primary drivers is biodiversity loss. And this is worldwide. And it also depends on biodiversity, because ecosystems are natural carbon sinks. And their losses, reversing their losses, we can slow perhaps climate change and build some resilience. So they're linked. Pesticides. It's a little surprised when I came across this chart. These are home pesticide use, home and garden. And the market is projected to grow in the next few years to $3.2 billion. We were making a little progress there, but it is a big business. So we're kind of awash in pesticides. If you add agrochemicals in, since 1990, we're using over 1 billion pounds annually. This lady's doing what I wish everyone would do, is educate yourself a little bit and read the labels and use them the way they were intended to be used if you have to use them. But we'll talk a little bit about alternatives and management. And then the big one, the class of insecticides known as neonicotinoids. They're systemic, means they're taken up through the whole plant. They were originally developed as a seed coating. So they would go on the seed. They thought this would be safer, and they are actually safer for mammals. They're not as toxic at all for mammals. But they would go on the seed coating, stay in the target plant, and target the pests. But that, unfortunately, is not what has happened. They're present in pollen, nectar, and foliage of non-crop plants. They're finding this. They are also posing a risk to non-target organisms, birds. Some birds are poisoned by eating the seeds, and they are also indirectly affected by a reduction in invertebrates that they can also eat and feed their young. They persist. They didn't believe in the beginning that they were very persistent chemicals, but they do in soil, and they accumulate. And they make their way, worst of all probably, is that they make their way into aquatic systems. And aquatic organisms are very, very sensitive to these pesticides. So the good news, I always like to leave a little good news in here, is that January 1st of this year in California, they are no longer allowed for sale in retail and garden centers and are restricted to indoor use. So you will not be able to find neonicotinoids. You may not see that word on the label. You would have to educate yourself a little bit if you have products at home. You can look up, and I have a list of these that are more commonly used, but things like imidacloprid, merit, those are some names that people might recognize. But anyway, you won't be able to buy them. If you need them for some reason, you can hire a certified pest control operator. They're the only ones that'll be allowed to apply them outside. There are some exceptions, and they're a little bit strange, but if you have a home orchard or vegetable garden or something, there's some interesting exceptions. So I would urge you to go and just look up the rules. I'm hoping no one thinks they need to use these chemicals, but you can educate yourself on that. And then the solution that we like to suggest, and that is more and more hopefully getting into even agrochemical use, is integrated pest management. We have a really great resource here out of UC Davis, the Agriculture and Natural Resources Department. They have a whole site called ipmucanr.edu. You can look up everything, any pest, anything, and get all of the information you need, starting with integrated pest management structure. First of all, is prevention, cultural controls like sanitation, cleaning up, the simple things of this sort, and then physical, hose them off, crush them, that kind of thing. Maybe biological, like this ladybug is doing on my very infested fennel plant. And then very last of all, chemicals. And I would like to remind you that just because it's an organic pesticide doesn't necessarily mean it's a good pesticide to use. So the information, though, is really readily available. And then the very last thing that is probably considered by most conservation organizations as the most trying and difficult and the greatest stressor is habitat loss and threat. Deforestation, I saw this with my own eyes in Brazil. They are rapidly removing natural areas and planting soybean to feed the cattle, which goes overseas. And they're not the only ones, and I'm not pointing a finger at that country. It was an incredible place to visit, but you do realize when you go to certain places that this is real. And fragmentation, urbanization, agricultural conversions. We've basically converted most arable land on the planet to agriculture that can be. So that isn't as bad of a loss anymore. I think there are other things that might be stressing it, but it is certainly one of them. So why do we need habitat? I think it's pretty obvious. They need flowering plants. They need nectar, pollen. They need the plant themselves. If you're a butterfly, your larvae need it. They need it in undisturbed areas. They need it pesticide-free. A lot of butterflies and bees are specialists. They need certain types of plants in certain families. And without that, they're gone as well. So diversity is something to take into consideration, and we can do this in our own yards too. I haven't spoken much about monarchs, although our organization is heavily involved, but we're not on a big monarch migration here in Chico. However, I have to give the bad news, and that is they've had the worst monarch count that they've had since they started counting monarchs, and they're under 10,000. They were once in the millions. So this might be a tipping point. They're optimistic, but it's a pretty dire situation for monarchs. So I'll get to some place at the end here where I can show you how you can report if you see them or the plants and that sort of thing that might help. We want to conserve what we have. This is Verbena Field. It's being rewilded with the Machuca tribe, and they're fabulous. And they've put in a ton of native buckwheat. Go there this spring when the buckwheat is blooming, and I guarantee you, you will see native bees, and you will be, amazed. Bumblebees and sweat bees and all the other ones will be there. So it's pretty remarkable what they're doing. We really enjoy it. And then I redid this was a patch of vinca, about 800 by 800 a few years back, and just decided to put in some pollinator-friendly plants and then create some nesting sites and provide a pesticide-free environment. And it wasn't as hard as I thought to do that. And another way to provide some habitat, of course, you've all heard, to remove or reduce lawn. They're monocultures. They don't provide a lot of benefit, and they're very resource intensive. And I like what they've done on the bottom, where they're prioritizing flowering plant zones. And another thing I came across, and I haven't found too much more to back this up, but I'll go ahead and put it out there because it was the Gulf Grass Institute, which I thought was kind of interesting, but it says you can mix low mow flowers into your lawn. And as they come up, if you mow to a height of about 4 inches, you preserve those flowers. And prunella, which is a flower that I grow, is one of them. So you'll mow above the flower, so you'll provide habitat, you won't destroy it, and just mow every couple weeks. Maybe just do this in the spring when the bees are foraging and building nests. So it was interesting, worth giving a try. And then what do I grow? A lot of people want to know. I brought some lists that were put together by Xerces, but they're pretty good for our area. A lot of them are for more generalist kinds of pollinators, but I think anything you want to put in along these lines is fine, mostly native. And in addition to flowers, shrubs, flowering trees, you want things that will start blooming early to the end of the growing season. And out of the Urban Bee Lab again, Dr. Frankie's work, he says ideally in a patch, maybe 3 foot by 3 foot if you can, of the same plant, because that saves the bee the floral constancy we talked about, and that they're foraging near their nests. This is resource intensive for them. And native plants are best. They offer many advantages, but you can put in non-native plants if they visit them and they take the pollen and nectar and use it. I have a non-native chase tree, Vitex, and the bees love it. But the worst is probably the double-headed flowers. There are no nectar or pollen resources in those plants because that's what the double petals come from, the anthers. So when you go to choose your plants, you want to think a little bit about the diversity, the growing seasons, if they're native and non, and then the bees and the pollinators will visit. And they will label plants as pollinator plants, but like we talked about before, it's hard to say unless they were actually using that and the plants reproducing from that. But you can watch and you can see if they're visiting. And you can also go online, and Calscape has a lot of information. There's quite a good set of resources out there that you can use to help you pick. This is a redbud in my yard. That's a bumblebee queen last spring. That's one of the earliest things to bloom in my yard. I don't have manzanita. So I saw them probably right about now. You can start looking for the bumblebee queens, and they're out collecting their nectar and pollen to start their next hive. Or nest, excuse me. You want drought-tolerant plants and hopefully grown without, make sure they're grown without pesticides. You can ask. This is very similar to what you offer through AltaCal with your backyard, certified backyard habitat program. You can create nesting sites, and a lot of people don't think about this for native bees, but it's important. We took down a tree, that's a log pile we made with the limbs and trunks. You can use rock walls, the cavity nesters love this, and the soil that we were talking about earlier. And those circles indicate where a native bee was seen entering or exiting. And so you can see that they definitely do need places, and it can be in urban kinds of places to nest. And again, lightly mulched. Oh, the master gardener in me has to tell you to be very fire aware with wood. Every time I say something about wood, they say, well, make sure they know you should be very careful with wood up next to your house. And that's a very good piece of advice. So leave pithy and woody stems, as we talked about earlier. On the bottom is silphium, which is a plant. I'm growing that in my yard. And you can see how that is easily softly like eaten out, basically. So that's a pithy stem. And then the Asclepias up at the top there, milkweed, also has a very, very soft wood, because they're not strong enough as a lot of these little carpenter bees like the Serratina to actually dig out like a big carpenter bee would. So they need it to be somewhat soft. And those are a few plants up there that are suggestions for our area. But why is it important? We want to leave these stems over the winter. We don't want a clean, manicured, perfect garden at the end of fall. Trust me, you're taking away a lot of habitat if you do. So these stem nesters are in there. They're ready to go over the winter. And if you cut that, they're gone. And if you leave it, they will emerge following spring. And then other ones that have come up in a recent winter, that would be from the year before. So the recent winter stalks, then you will cut those back in the spring, about a month from now, maybe to 15 to 24 inches. And the reason that's important is because you want them up off the ground for predators and that sort of thing. And they seem to do better when they're up a little bit higher. And then the newly emerging bees will have a place to build their nest. So it's a cycle. So that's one reason why we advocate doing this. And usually you can see the perennial coming up around that. It just grows up around those things. You don't even see them in a very short time and they just decompose. So they're not really, it's a new aesthetic, like no lawn. These are artificial nest blocks. There were a number of opinions on this, obviously, just about anything, but I use them. I've had them in my yard for years and I love them. I guess it'd be like saying I also have a bird feeder, but they're tunnel nests for the tunnel nesters, and these are leafcutter bees. They're Megachile is the family, and they construct their nests with the leaf pieces down inside these tubes. If you want to know how to do this, oh, and this shows you what those look like when you open up the block and take a look. They're all nicely snug and cozy in there, and they're going to overwinter, and then they'll hatch the next, they'll emerge soon in probably April or May. We have a really nice guideline. I brought the book with me. It's actually right here, and it's a really thick book on farming for bees. But this section, protecting and creating bee nest sites and how to do this, the whole how-to, the maintenance, if you want to do a bee house, is in here. And you can go to the website and also get the information. It's exactly the same as the booklet. So I wanted to play this. And I learned that you turn your phone like this. I haven't learned. But they're the males. So I put my nest tubes out, and you can see all the activity. Those are the males, and they're very anxiously looking for females. They don't care about me, and they can't sting anyway. And they're just frantically looking for a male to mate with and bumping each other out of the way. And there are one or two females that are kind of going into the tubes, probably trying to escape them. But that's basically what you see. And so and then they will die off, the males, but then you'll see the activity of the females through the course of the summer. And they have more than one generation, which is actually nice, and must be doing something right. The main thing is to have resources for them, have flowering plants that they'll use. So this is another thing that we can do. And again, it's a new aesthetic, but dried and fallen plant material. Xerces calls it their Leave the Leave campaign. And you're basically leaving overwintering sites. Like we talked about, these animals are overwintering. They're either a larva, a chrysalis, or a queen. Eggs. And they use these leaves and fallen plant material to get through the winter. So it's really helpful to them if you can just sort of, you don't want them on your lawn, fine, or if there's too many and they're too thick, spread them out a little bit, put them on your vegetable beds, your flower beds, spread them around trees and shrubs. Don't pile them up the trunks because, again, that's not healthy, but they're good for soil building, moisture retention, and weed protection. And then this is our program, similar to your certified habitat program. We call it the Pollinator Habitat Pledge, and it's basically the same thing, and it's everything that we talked about, and you can go online to bring back the pollinators, fill it out, and you'll get this nifty, I love yard signs, I probably have 5. I never put them up, but I just really like them. Anyway, with a donation, then you can get a nice yard sign letting people know what you're doing, which is really important. Education is the key to a lot of this. These are some of our community science programs. This is me up at the Butte Creek Ecological Reserve doing a bumblebee survey. We catch them, put them on ice, photograph them for the scientists to identify, and then let them go. And that's called Bumblebee Atlas. You can participate. They're starting their webinar training soon, within the next month. The Bumblebee Watch is for anyone who sees a bumblebee, you can report it. And then the Monarch databases are very similar. The Bumblebee Atlas needs a little bit of training, but it's not really hard, and it's really, really cool to get out there and, I don't know, you tiptoe through the tulips and collect bumblebees. What could be bad about that? And then Xerces doesn't work alone. We have membership. We have people like you contributing, foundations, scientists. We're a research and evidence-based organization, and that's really important. And that's why we have a lot of respect from people from around the world. And farmers and land managers, we work very closely with. I have a lot of information on that for increasing habitats on farms and larger properties and corporate sponsors. I kind of skipped over federal. I don't know why.
Don't count on it.
And then we also have download a bowl fact sheets and guidelines. All of these things are available. Just go to xerces.org, start looking, and all of this is readily available. I brought some things with me if you care to look. And if you have children, I have a couple of really nice books that we do for children, for pollinators and invertebrates, rather. And questions or comments? That was it.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
See if anyone on Zoom has questions, but anybody in the audience have any questions for our speaker?
Yeah, I was just wondering what a double-headed flower was.
So they breed flowers to, like a rose, to have extra petals, essentially. And so they look like they're doubled, right? And the one that comes to mind the most is a rose. But they have to use the anther to do that. That's where the petal comes from. So that's what a double-headed flower is. I know I kind of think that maybe they have two heads out here, but they're inside.
Yeah.
Hi.
Just wondering, with all the species, do any of them pollinate specific flowers, or are they all?
Yes, yeah, good question. And I did mention a little bit about specialists. So we call those specialist bees, and they are very much, they very much need a particular plant or a family of plants and have adapted and evolved with that plant. The plant goes away, they probably go away. Very few of them can transfer to another flower. These are found very, very readily in the desert areas, and this is one of the reasons we have a lot of bee diversity in the deserts. So you'll see a lot of specialist bees there. That flower will bloom, they'll come up, they'll collect their pollen and nectar, and then they're done.
Do they, I've also read that a lot of bees get a certain amount of protein from actually eating pollen.
Yes, they mostly feed it to their larvae. But protein has a huge pollen has a big protein count in some cases, almost over 60% for some pollen. And it does vary. By comparison, steak is like 32% protein or 20-something%. So it's very high in protein and all the other essential nutrients they need. But they will eat a little pollen. Male bees will eat pollen, but mostly they use nectar for the energy. It's a vast carbohydrate source. So they're mostly feeding the pollen. They put it together in a ball, and that's what they lay the egg on, which is what that little picture on the bottom was showing you. And their larvae will hatch, and then they will consume that.
For the leaf cutters, those tubes, they look like bamboo, are they?
The tubes, those are reeds, natural reeds. Apparently you don't want to use bamboo, so I'm just going with the recommendation. I go to a site called Crown Bees, and they've been really helpful. I really like the guy, and I buy my reeds from them. So I have to change the reeds out. If you do some maintenance, it's not that hard. It's like you have to clean your bird feeders and stuff too, right? But there's a little trick to it, and you figure it out. But the natural reeds apparently are the best. You can use cardboard, but I guess bamboo has some problems. What you're really worrying about with bee houses are pests like fungus and other things that can chalk brood, can get into them, different things, and parasites and predators. So, you know, there's a few things that can get into your bee tubes. But to be honest, I hope I'm not jinxing myself, but I have never had a problem. But I'm pretty careful about maintenance. I clean the houses at the end of the year, take the tubes out. I have a bag of, it's a very fine material, and I put the bags in that and close it up, and they sit in my garage for the winter. And then I clean the houses really well and put those back out in probably, I'll put those out late March, early April. And then I'll watch the weather and then put the tubes out, and then that's when I'll see the bees emerging. So it's just a cycle, and you just have to use a little common sense. But the booklet I pointed out online, Farming for Bees at Xerces, is really, really good about explaining it all.
All right, a question from Zoom. Someone's asking about bats. Did you mention that bats are pollinators?
I did mention that. It was in the part of vertebrates as also pollinators. We don't have pollinating bats necessarily here because our bats are insectivorous, but in South America, they're very, very important, and Asia and other parts of the world.
Another question about, so you said from Lisa Williams, you said that pregnant female leaves her nest after hibernation. Was she pregnant when she went into hibernate? How long is gestation?
That's a great question. No, she wasn't pregnant in the sense that she had ready to go babies. She is mated, and the sperm from the male bee goes into a special structure called a spermatheca. She holds that, and she only releases that when she starts to lay eggs. So the eggs are only fertilized as she decides to fertilize them. And so she is coming out ready to go with the sperm and her eggs. That is not going to form a viable egg or larva until she decides that that's what she wants. They can also control the sex, like we were talking about. So they're fascinating animals.
All right, couple more questions. All right, so what resources would you recommend for doing basic bee identification in your backyard?
That's another good question. There are a lot of them, but there's some really specific bee ID books for the Western states and for California. There's a couple of them that you can find. The Bees in Your Backyard is probably a really fun resource to look at, but if you really want to get out there and just start to ID, Western Bees of North America, Olivia Carroll and her partner Joe Wilson, and then out of the Urban Bee Lab, they do have an online presence, and they can help you with bee ID there, kind of get you started in that direction. There are Bumblebee guides as well that you can pick up. So I would look for things that take into account where you live, that you're in California, that you're in Northern California, and you'll find plenty. Also, Xerces might be able to direct you, or if you send me an email, I can give you a list of some really good starter books.
Awesome. All right, someone else is asking, any info about European paper wasp, their effect on monarchs?
I haven't heard anything about their effects on monarchs. It's a really good question because I'm not the monarch expert at all, and I don't know a whole lot about what their stressors are right now and all of the things that are going on, because we just don't have that many up here. And if you go to Xerces though, and you put that question in, they can probably answer that for you pretty readily, because they have some very, very good monarch experts working with them. But it's one to consider, because the paper wasp is an introduced species too.
Oh, really?
European.
Right. So someone else, Don Garcia, is asking, do you use iNaturalist for bee ID?
I do, especially for a couple bumblebees that I came across that I was very curious about. iNaturalist is a great resource. Anyone can use it. It's free. You can put your species on there, or you put your whatever it is you're interested in. Anything. I put fungus on there. Anything that you are curious about, and they love to help you out. So yes, I do use it.
All right, so as I was saying, what's good conservation practices for the insects and the bees is good for the birds too. As we all know, insects are a major food source for the birds. So thank you so much, Michelle, for enlightening us on the world of insects and how we can help them.